Let's jump into this interview with Whitney Webb. We started off talking about the parallels between coronavirus and some earlier pandemic simulations that were run by the government. Whitney also drew some parallels to the anthrax attacks that happened following 9/11 and the connections between those anthrax attacks and some of these simulations. Again, it's all very interesting and it's all very interconnected. So without any further ado, here's my interview with Whitney Webb.
Into the anthrax attacks in 2001. That investigation is actually super controversial if you actually look at the evidence, so much so that the lead investigator on that case, a guy named Richard Lambert, ended up leaving the FBI and then filing a whistleblower lawsuit because he said that he was obstructed and unable to investigate, and that higher ups in the Bureau and in the Bush White House were trying to prevent the FBI from actually finding who was responsible. And in the early days of the investigation, several other things happened that point to a very deliberate cover-up, because it was determined very early on that the anthrax used in the attacks had originated from a U.S. bioweapons lab, either Fort Detrick or some other facility. Some people have pointed to Utah, Dugway over there, potentially being a site for that. And one of the things Lambert revealed is that the guy they eventually pinned the attacks on, a guy named Bruce Ivins, when they were building their case against him, they intentionally withheld what this guy said was a mountain of evidence that would have exonerated this guy, because they just wanted to pin it on someone to make it go away. But the fact that it was a domestic source in the media, even after it was known to the FBI to be a domestic source, tried to pin this on a foreign entity, specifically the one outlined in Dark Winter. I mean, it's all very odd. And so the fact that all of this went on, and that the people that wrote the simulation were making these like very creepy predictions, telling people in the top positions of political power to take Cipro to prevent antibiotics, but not postal workers or people that would have been like put in the line that attack ended up taking place, is very suspect, as is the fact that a lot of those same people ended up being involved in this FBI investigation and in obstructing that investigation, like I just pointed out. Okay, so some of those individuals, specifically Thomas Inglesby of the Center for Health Security, the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, and Robert Cadlick, who is now the Department of Health and Human Services Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, were both involved in Dark Winter. Right after 9/11, Cadlick became Homeland Security Advisor to the Bush administration for biowarfare and bioterrorism right before the anthrax attack. And Thomas Inglesby personally briefed Dick Cheney about Dark Winter right after 9/11, when Dick Cheney was already on Cipro, right? And then they were both involved in the FBI investigation, or sorry, only Cadlick was involved in the FBI investigation, but Inglesby, like in 2002, attempted to say that the 9/11 hijackers had 9/11 using like this very discredited scientific analysis, but that it got media coverage trying to claim that it wasn't a domestic source and that it was actually obtained by the 9/11 hijackers and brought here, which of course is not what actually happened. But anyway, those guys, Inglesby was the moderator for Event 201, and the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security that sponsored Dark Winter was one of the three main sponsors for Event 201. And Robert Cadlick is the guy that wrote and led Crimson Contagion, which wasn't just one simulation. It was a series last year of 4 simulations simulating a pandemic flu outbreak originating from China that it later spread globally. And it involved 19 different federal agencies, 12 states, and a bunch of private corporations, including the company that's going to build the Jared Kushner-backed coronavirus surveillance system. So that's interesting. And Event 201, of course, simulated a coronavirus outbreak that went global and killed an estimated 65 million people, and talked about things like censoring online criticism, limited internet shutdowns, which are also themes that are brought up at Dark Winter, among other things. So definitely.
Really, they were talking about that all the way back then.
Yeah, at Dark Winter, they were saying that one of the things that came up in the simulation was concern about online misinformation, and this is in 2001, right? Wow. So obviously the concern about that totally amplified after 2016, so it obviously got a lot more attention in Event 201, but it's definitely something that took place in Dark Winter as well. And Dark Winter talked about a lot of very disturbing ways the government should consider responding to pandemic situations, including the declaration of martial law, invoking the Insurrection Act. In one of the fictional news clips that were used in this exercise, There's people trying to escape the epicenter of the pandemic, which is in Oklahoma, in the exercise, and are trying to cross the border into Texas, and they get shot by National Guard live on camera. You can, like, the newscaster is saying, oh, it's a war zone out here. It's all very disturbing stuff.
So you covered Dark Winter and Event 201. What were Urban Outbreak and Crimson Contagion?
Okay, so Crimson Contagion was the Department of Health and Human Services. It was 4 different simulations of various sizes. The biggest one took place in August, but these 4 exercises took place over the course of January to August of last year. And as I mentioned a little bit ago, it was 19 federal agencies, 12 states, and then a bunch of private companies, including, I think, Aetna, and a bunch of other, like, big corporations, and then this military intelligence contractor that's going to be making this surveillance system if Jared Kushner's plan is approved. So we'll see. And so the most important part of that simulation, I would argue, would be the last part, which was the biggest part, because it was 4 different days. And I think something that's really interesting and that needs to be looked at more is that the 3rd day of that last Crimson Contagion exercise, it was devoted entirely to finance. And the Secretary of Treasury, the Treasury Department, led by Steve Mnuchin, was very, very involved and participated directly in this exercise. And obviously in the finance day would have been leading that, but exactly what they gamed out on that day specifically has not been made public. But I think it's really interesting when you look at how the coronavirus so-called relief effort has played out since then, because it was basically, this 1,000+ page bill that was, like, ready to go. And just like the Patriot Act, the Patriot Act was written well before 9/11, but after 9/11, it was like, bam, let's pass this. And they were really promoting it be passed with little to no debate. And so what you see now with this coronavirus relief bill that gave $4 trillion to Wall Street, essentially 4 times bigger than the 2008 Wall Street bailout, it gets pushed through much the same way and was basically already there waiting to go. And I don't really want to speculate too much, but the fact that there was this finance day simulating pandemic response, and it was the Treasury Department there, and Steve Mnuchin was pushing this bill, and he's a former Goldman Sachs guy, I think there might be something there in terms of, like, when they decided what the relief efforts would be and when. But obviously they would need to be a little more forthcoming about what exactly they talked about. And there's some other red flags there in terms of what was discussed. Like I said, about Event 201, they were talking about concern about online misinformation. That was also something that came up in Crimson Contagion, as was a need for, like, this contact tracing surveillance type software, which is actually was originally pushed by In-Q-Tel, which is the CIA's venture capital arm, back in 2017. A woman named Tara O'Toole, who is currently In-Q-Tel's executive vice president, was talking about the need to use, like, geolocation and private health data and smartphone data of American citizens in order to fight the next global pandemic. This was, more than 3 years ago. And what's interesting is that this O'Toole woman, Tara O'Toole, is a longtime co-worker of Thomas Inglesby, and she used to lead the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security before he became director, and along with Thomas Inglesby was the main co-author of Dark Winter, and also briefed Dick Cheney, after 9/11. So it's a lot of the same suspects coming up in terms of determining, a lot of the policies that we're seeing being implemented now. And I think part of the reason that it's so interconnected is because there hasn't really been much media scrutiny, or really scrutiny at all, of post 9/11 biodefense policy in the U.S., which has essentially been about creating a racket for big pharmaceutical companies, as opposed to investing in things like healthcare surge capacity or protective equipment for workers. Because something that comes up in Dark Winter and Crimson Contagion is that there's not enough protective supplies for healthcare workers. There's no surge capacity in healthcare. And so they knew this in 2001, and they knew this last year, and in every other simulation since. Why didn't they do something? Well, that's because biodefense policy, which has been, post 9/11 biodefense policy has been dominated really by the legislation that Robert Kadlec oversaw when he was Bush's Homeland Security advisor for biodefense. It is basically about stockpiling vaccines for smallpox and anthrax, and attacks that have, like, never really taken, for pathogens and bioweapons that have never actually been unleashed in the public. And in the case of anthrax, it was unleashed by someone working for the U.S. military, and we still don't really know who did it, right? So basically what I call this a racket because not only do they stockpile these vaccines only have a shelf life of like 3 to 4 years. So they eventually become useless and constantly have to be replenished. And the government pays premium prices on these vaccines, way more than the cost of production. So essentially you're having, a built-in market for a lot of these vaccine companies, and they know that those vaccines will never end up being used. And some of those vaccines, particularly the anthrax vaccine, has a very controversial history that I talk about in a recent article about this company called Bioport and Emergent Biosolutions, which has been a huge beneficiary of this policy. And one of the dark winter guys that I mentioned a little bit ago, Jerome Hauer, has been on their board of directors for years. Right. And now they're about to benefit from getting all these coronavirus they're backing 2 coronavirus vaccine candidates and also 2 experimental plasma blood treatments that are being directly funded, some of them by the U.S. government. So it's basically like a biodefense mafia. Honestly, I would call them sort of these like, career bioterrorist doomsayer guys that have been on since the Bush days. And a lot of these big pharmaceutical companies have consistently been working together over the years, and this is kind of the end result.